We're joined again by Whitney Webb from Chile. Whitney has just completed part 4 of her massive series on time. And she says at the end of the piece that it's over, but it isn't over because there are going to be individual stories such as the circumstances around his death, etc. But you have just written essentially a book that has been spread out over 4 parts, and it is an extraordinary wealth of information. And we welcome you, Whitney, back to CN Live. Your first appearance here has been quite popular, and I think people are very eager to hear you talk about part 4 as well. Now, in part 4, you, of course, focus on the Clintons, but there's so much around that that it's not only about the Clintons. But let's start with the Mena Airport in Arkansas. Lots been said about that airport. That this was correct me if I'm wrong, this was the place where Nicaraguan Contras were armed, and the planes would come back filled with drugs. Basically, that was the place it was offloaded. There was a CIA-run operation for the most part. How do we know that Governor Bill Clinton at the time in Arkansas was aware of this CIA operation? Wouldn't the CIA want to have as few people as possible know and not busybody local authorities?
Well, a lot of the evidence for Bill Clinton's involvement comes from people that were involved in that operation and later spoke out, including Terry Reid, who was working for Oliver North during that time and was based in Arkansas. And also testimony from people like him saying that a lot of this money that was made from the sale of drugs and things like that was laundered through state Arkansas financial institutions. And there's been several documentaries over the years that have sort of tied in some of the top figures at those same financial institutions to Bill Clinton. We also know that during this period of time, it was Bill Clinton's half-brother also got busted for involvement with this this drug peddling, I guess you could call it, this drug trafficking, and there's other links there too, going back to people like Jackson Stevens, who really bankrolled Bill Clinton's career in Arkansas, and was also a major donor to the Reagan and later the Bush White House. He was very connected not just to Bill Clinton through his political contributions, but also to Hillary Clinton, who at the Rose Law Firm represented several businesses of Jackson Stevens. And Jackson Stevens was very connected to CIA fronts, very involved in Iran-Contra as well, and in the money laundering and things like that were going on as part of this operation, including BCCI and some other scandals at the period of time as well that also involved U.S. intelligence to some extent, including the theft of Promise software, which I talked about earlier in my series, that a subsidiary, an electronics company owned by Jackson Stevens and represented by Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster and Webster Hubble, was very pivotal in selling this bugged software with a trapdoor in it for U.S. and Israeli intelligence to banks all over the United States and the world. So there were a lot of CI connections during this time, and from people like Terry Reid specifically, and also Barry Seal, who was known to be very involved in what was going on in Mena, talked about the Clintons and them being aware of it. Terry Reid specifically talked about meetings that he partook in where Bill Clinton was present and was talking to Bill Barr. Bill Barr represented himself as an emissary of then CIA Director Bill Casey, and how they were discussing Bill Clinton's involvement, and how Clinton and the state of Arkansas, while Clinton was governor, had been their quote unquote greatest asset, the CIA's greatest asset during this time, because really Mena was really crucial to what was going on as part of Iran-Contra. It wasn't just arms and weapon sales. Also, there was a training ground 10 miles north, I believe, of Mena Airport where paramilitary or rather members of the Contra and other Central American paramilitaries were brought in to be trained. And all of this was done, was overseen to some extent by Oliver North, who we know to be one of the key figures and really carrying out the logistics of Iran-Contra. So I hope that that was enough answer to that question.
I'm particularly interested in the Bill Barr connection because, for example, you have a quote here that Barr from a book, but I don't know if Barr has ever been asked about this, where he essentially promises the presidency to Clinton if he shuts up about this. Now, you know what I'm referring to, right?
Right, right. This is the book from Terry Reid, who I just mentioned, who was a CIA operative who was working for Oliver North during this period of time, and this is what he remembered. This is how he remembered the meeting having occurred. So I mean, take that for what it's worth, but you know, it is telling that there has been, you know, Bill Barr, at least to my knowledge, hasn't been questioned about this type of association, but it is consistent with you know, when you start looking at the power structure of the United States, this sort of partisanship of, you know, Democrats and Republicans, when you get higher up, you know, a lot of times they work together. And the types of alliances made aren't necessarily along party lines. When you really get to the halls of power, it's about, you know, other types of alliances, sort of like what we saw happen, you know, in this case with Mina Airport. Even though it was a Democratic governor, and it was technically, you know, run by Democrats during this time, working with the Republican administration in their intelligence during this period of time. I mean, it was, you know, it was a very profitable alliance, right? The Clintons profited from this significantly, and it strongly advanced, you know, Bill Clinton's political career, and actually the presidency, the presidential campaign. Jackson Stevens again played a key role in that. When Bill Clinton's polling numbers were down, it was one of Jackson Stevens' banks that gave him like his campaign several millions of dollars in credit, just like that, to make sure that he kept going. And remember that Jackson Stevens was also a longtime donor to George H.W. Bush and Reagan, and so you can sort of see that a lot of the money going between these people comes from a lot of the same donors who, as I mentioned earlier, Jackson Stevens was connected to a lot of this corruption rather directly through his association with BCCI.
I want to ask you about that, Elizabeth, 1 second. I was looking at the book False Prophets that was written in the 90s, one of the first books about BCCI by a Wall Street Journal reporter and another guy, I can't remember right now. And it says in there that the FBI had actually begun an investigation into the Clintons and their BCCI role, and nothing came of that. Just like the fact that that you write that Bill Clinton sent National Guard troops from Arkansas to fight in Nicaragua, whereas many of the other governors at this national governors meeting refused to do that. And some of the names there of the people who refused to do that were listed as presidential hopefuls, and we've never heard of them again. Whereas Bill Clinton did send his troops, and we know what happened there. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then sorry, then Elizabeth, take over, please.
Well, I think this sort of thing, you know, that happened there, and how some of the other presidential hopefuls, as you mentioned, during that time were not supportive of Reagan's hardline policies. We saw, you know, Clinton obviously rewarded for that, and there seems to be indication that maybe Clinton may have been motivated to send troops, even though it wasn't politically popular, especially within his own party during the time, potentially because he had skin in the game, but also because, you know, a lot of times, you know, these sort of hardline policies, or, you know, regime change, or foreign wars abroad and things like that, are usually bipartisan, and people on either party that reject them usually are not rewarded by in big party politics, especially when it comes to presidential politics. I mean, we see this today with Tulsi Gabbard being very, you know, basically taken out of the DNC primary now and blocked from the debates because of her stance on these types of quote unquote hardline policies. We saw it on the Republican side with Ron Paul in 2012. So, you know, it's pretty consistent that, you know, people that have political aspirations, they know that it's easier to advance if they you know, are hawkish, generally speaking. And so, you know, even in conservatism, for example, and the neoconservatives, of course, were really involved in what was going on in the Reagan era. There were some, you know, Reagan era officials like Elliott Abrams, who actually started off as, you know, chiefs of staffs for Democratic senators, who were also really hawkish and considered neoconservatives, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example. So I think it's just another example of, you know, how some of the decisions that are made by people that want to advance, specifically to the presidency, aren't about partisan ideology. It's about what they know about how the system really works, and how the easiest ways to advance in that, and that's really embracing the status quo, the military-industrial complex, regime change wars, and other things that the CIA is often involved in, including money laundering and other things of that nature.
Great. I want to read a short paragraph from your article. I mean, obviously not for you, but just to anchor our audience in my question I have for you. You write that in an exclusive interview, Bob Petrakis told Minpress that Epstein and Wexner's involvement with SAT's relocation to Ohio had caused suspicion among some prominent state and local officials that the two were working with U.S. intelligence. Then you go on to say that Petrakis specifically stated that then Ohio Inspector General David Strutz and then Sheriff of Franklin County Earl Smith had personally told him that they believed that both Epstein and Wexner had ties to the CIA. These claims further corroborate what was first reported by Nigel Russer in the Evening Standard, that Epstein had claimed to have worked for the CIA in the past. So I wanted to just ask you, if we take those claims that do seem to be corroborated as true, that Epstein really was working with the CIA, what's the significance of that connection? What do we make of that? What does that tell us?
Okay, so to explain a little bit of the background of that quote you just read, SAT stands for Southern Air Transport. That used to be called Air America. It's a well-known CIA front company that was actually used in Iran-Contra and actually used in what we were just talking about at Mina Airport. For example, Barry Seal, who I mentioned earlier, was known to use SAT or Southern Air Transport planes. And even though it came out by the late 80s that this was definitively a CIA front company, even though it wasn't owned directly by the CIA anymore, it was then owned by a former lawyer for the CIA named James Bastian. What happened is that, this airline was based out of Miami, Florida for a long time. But around 1995, and actually a year prior to that, negotiations began, led by Leslie Wexner and his close associate at the time, and for many years before and after that, Jeffrey Epstein, who was running logistics for the Limited, were really the main force behind this push to get Southern Air Transport to relocate to Rickenbacker Airport in Columbus, Ohio. And this was, and it was named to be, the Limited was said to be one of the main reasons that Southern Air Transport actually did relocate to Ohio, because the main commercial route that they were running was from Hong Kong to Columbus, officially bringing, textiles made in China for the Limited, which is, a clothing company that Wexner owns, to the U.S., and that was, the main money maker that had motivated this, along with this very attractive deal of incentives from Ohio's government, actually. And of course, Wexner has a lot of pull in Ohio politics because he's one of the wealthiest people, I think the wealthiest person in the state. So what's significant here is that out of all the airlines in the United States, Wexner and Epstein choose the only airline that is outed, like publicly known at the time, to be a CIA cutout, which I think is really significant, that of all the airlines in the US that exist, that's the one they go for, right? And the Ohio government supported this, and even though it was known at the time that their association with the CIA was fact, it was good enough for them that the president of Southern Air Transport at the time, William Langton, said, "We're not affiliated with the CIA anymore, just trust us." But this actually turned out not to be true, because the very day that Southern Air Transport declared bankruptcy, I believe it was in 1998, the same day the CIA Inspector General released a very damning report about how Southern Air Transport remained, well after they had been outed for their role in Iran-Contra, involved in drug trafficking and the trafficking of lots of other things. So that makes what Bob Petrakis told me really significant about what he had heard from Ohio's Inspector General during the time and the Franklin County Sheriff about their belief that Wexner and Epstein were doing some sort of activities for the CIA. Prior to this, Wexner was known to have associations with organized crime, and the people doing logistics on the ground for him in the United States, trucking mainly, were known to be organized crime affiliates. Walsh Trucking Company is the name of that company, and they had longstanding ties to the Genovese crime family of New York, which is, of course, the other half of the National Crime Syndicate, with the other half being Mayor Lansky, who is a figure that comes up a lot in my 4-part series. So what David Sturtz, this Ohio Inspector General, suspected too, is that it was being used, this route from Columbus to Hong Kong, being used for smuggling. And he actually told, the term he used to describe it was the Mayor Lansky run, because he thought that there was some sort of smuggling activity going on. Based on Wexner's past, what he knew, what was known, at least to officials at the time, but didn't get a lot of press about his organized crime ties, and the fact that they sought out Southern Air Transport. So beyond that, talking about the Nigel Rosser article and Epstein's alleged ties to the CIA, apparently during the 1990s, Epstein would tell people that he had previously worked for the CIA. So that would, if he was saying this in the 90s and was associated with Southern Air Transport then, that would suggest then that in the 1980s he was doing stuff for the CIA. But we know that he was doing after he left Bear Stearns, which is his first experience, his first job on Wall Street, where he went to work after the Dalton School. He left Bear Stearns, and exactly what he was doing isn't really known. He claimed that he was a financial bounty hunter, which is the term he used. He described it to friends, saying that he was hunting down money that powerful people in governments wanted him to find, and also hiding money for those same powerful people. To me, that means tax evasion. That probably means money laundering, things like that. And a big clue here is that one of his only known clients during that time was Adnan Khashoggi, who, of course, Epstein leaves Bear Stearns in 1981, and by 1981, Khashoggi has already been recruited by the Mossad of Israel for several years, and at this time he's also working with the CIA in brokering the first arms deals that later become known as Iran-Contra, at least in the Middle East side. And he was also known, there were several arms dealers, of course, involved in Iran-Contra. Khashoggi was a major one, but not the only one. But he was considered to be the quote-unquote banker of a lot of these arms deals, and was involved in moving the money around, even in the arms deals he didn't personally broker. And he did that through BCCI. So if we have Jeffrey Epstein claiming to have worked for the CIA apparently in the 1980s, and he was known to be working for Adnan Khashoggi during that time, and Khashoggi was, sought out Epstein for financial services of some sort, and we know that he was using BCCI, it seems to point to some sort of association existing between what Jeffrey Epstein was doing in the early 1980s, at least until he met up with Wexner in 1985, in BCCI. Of course, are we going to see documentation of Jeffrey Epstein, signing BCCI stuff? Well, I mean, even when BCCI collapsed in 1991, I mean, a lot of documents that had existed then were not revealed, or they claimed there was no documentation of it. Apparently, they really enjoyed shredding documents over there. And of course, people that had obtained printouts of these, BCCI, their most controversial arms transfers, including ones involving Oliver North, for example, that were obtained by journalists like Danny Casolaro, those disappeared, specifically when Danny Casolaro was found dead in his hotel room in West Virginia, that basically all of his notes, including those BCCI, the documentation from BCCI itself, all went missing. So, I'm just going by what's publicly available and making, assumptions based on that. But I think based on what I just laid out, it's not that far-fetched to suggest that he likely had some sort of association with BCCI. And I think the fact that years later he would get involved with another front company for the CIA in a later period, along with Leslie Wexner, also suggests some sort of affiliation with U.S. intelligence to some extent.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and that brings me to my next question, which is, so much of this series, this 4-part series, it's not only about Epstein. You cover massive numbers of links to individuals, to corporations, to intelligence interests. But one of the kind of the threads that goes through all 4 of your pieces, all 4 parts of the series, is that this is kind of the underbelly, the third branch of Iran-Contra that was never really, truly talked about at the time. It wasn't exposed at the time. It seems to me that what you've outlined is sort of the child human trafficking side of this web that leads back to Iran-Contra. So if we take that as sort of the third arm of the guns and drug trafficking in that scandal, can we look forward and look for child trafficking when we see gun and drug trafficking in present day scandals and situations?
Yeah, well, I think if you just look at the 1980s and even BCCI and Iran-Contra and all of that, you see there that there are actually links to a lot of of the trafficking rings, for example, that we knew existed during that period of time. For example, Larry King, who ran the Franklin, the ring that became, the subject of the Franklin scandal. There were connections between him and Iran-Contra figures, and he was known, the ring he was operating was known to be connected to the one that was run by the Washington lobbyist Craig Spence. Craig Spence previously claimed that he had worked for the CIA involving the trafficking of drugs from Central America to the United States. And at these blackmail parties he would have where minors were present, he would also offer cocaine that had come from Central America to people that were present there that he was trying to entrap if they didn't want to be caught in sexually compromising situations. He would offer them illicit drugs and use that as blackmail instead. And there's a lot of overlap there, unfortunately, that hasn't really gotten enough coverage in the context of Iran-Contra, that there are some connections there that are quite disturbing. Also, when we talk about BCCI, BCCI is well known for its involvement in money laundering, the funding of terrorist groups, the financing of the drug trade, things like that. But actually in the official report on BCCI that was authored by John Kerry, there were two senators, John Kerry was one and I'm forgetting the other's name, sorry, but in that report it talks about how BCCI was also known to be involved in basically the trafficking of underage girls. Specifically the incident it mentions was that they would, BCCI officials would basically buy underage girls from their parents and give them to prominent members of the ruling class in the United Arab Emirates as a way to get favors or advance whatever agenda or whatever policy the bank wanted implemented in the UAE. And that some of these girls were prepubescent and some of them were basically either sold into slavery to these families or they were basically leased out. Which is a term I really hate to use here because I just don't really know what other way, how else to describe it. But, basically, they would pay the parents and take the child for a period of time and then they would be sexually exploited and then returned to the parents. And we actually in recent weeks, similar stories involving what Jeffrey Epstein was doing have come to light, where basically he paid the parents of 3 young girls in France who I believe were around 12 years old, they were triplets, to come to the US for his birthday, perform sexual acts on them, and then they would be sent back. They were sent back to their parents. So, this is another side to this dark underworld that doesn't get enough coverage, probably because, it seems, more outrageous, than arms trafficking, drug trafficking. That's the publicly known story about Iran-Contra and a lot of the players involved in Iran-Contra, but there appears to have been a lot more than that going on that hasn't really gotten the attention it deserves, frankly. We also know that some other charities that were connected to, the Reagan administration or Iran-Contra figures in general during this time, like AmeriCares, that was connected to, I think the main funder of that was a longtime associate of George H.W. Bush. They were funding branches of some Catholic charities that were run by former CIA assets that were involved in Iran-Contra to some extent, and those were alleged by John DeCamp, who's a former state senator of Nebraska, who sort of investigated this stuff for a long time and very in depth. That the Guatemala branch specifically of one of these charities, Covenant House, was trafficking children from Central America during the period of Iran-Contra to the United States, specifically to these sexual blackmail pedophile rings that existed during the time. So this definitely is something that deserves a lot more coverage and is really part of the, I guess you could say, the hidden history of what was really going on in Iran-Contra during this time, because a lot of this activity, this criminal activity we saw in Iran-Contra, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, very frequently, it also is accompanied by sex trafficking and child trafficking. And we see that in war zones even today. For example, if you look at the Syrian conflict, for example, we know that there was a lot of arms smuggling going on then, but there's also been a lot of people smuggling, and that's also happened through the refugee crisis and the porous nature of borders and conflict. It was also known to have happened, human trafficking during what was going on in Bosnia during the Clinton administration and the Kosovo and all of that. that there was a lot of child trafficking and human trafficking going on during that period of time. In addition to all the other stuff, the covert funding of armed groups and things like that during that time. So, this is just one angle of this larger, I don't really know what to call it. I really think it's a criminal enterprise, that involves, destabilization, where, there's arms trafficking, anything you can traffic, they do it. And that includes people. And, that aspect is usually the one that gets the least amount of coverage, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And what the other thing leading on from that, and just as a sort of side note, is that the discussion of child abuse, child trafficking, and other types of trafficking under the guise of philanthropy is something that I've reported on a lot, that is not outlandish at all, whether you're talking about Epstein and his charities, or whether you're talking about some aspects of childcare organizations that are either operating in the United States, or NGOs that go operate in places like Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, or those types of situations, right, that are later found to have been either trafficking children or otherwise taking advantage of them. Unfortunately, there is a huge context of that. But to go back to your article, I wanted to ask you about the significance of the fact that you discussed the ways in which Clinton was deeply linked to Epstein before he was sort of popularly said to have met, Epstein was supposedly met Clinton via Ghislaine Maxwell. And you talk about the earlier links that he had to Epstein. Can you talk about that a little bit, and why it's so important that that's known history, that it wasn't just, meeting through parties and that type of thing later on?
Right. So the mainstream, I guess, narrative you could say that's really been sold about the Epstein-Clinton relationship is that this is something that started after Clinton had left office, and mainly began in the early 2000s. And it was also said to have been mainly forged by Ghislaine Maxwell, who we know, later on in the 2000s became very close to the Clinton families, particularly Chelsea Clinton was at Chelsea Clinton's wedding, vacationed with Chelsea Clinton, things like that. But actually, this was actually from the Daily Beast, who got information from I believe the Clinton Presidential Library, that showed that Clinton's ties to the Clinton White House, Epstein's ties to the Clinton White House actually went back to 1993, when he was listed as a donor dinner, at a donor dinner accompanied by Ghislaine Maxwell, that had been organized by this longtime associate of Clinton named A. Paul Prosperi, who actually was very close to Epstein as well. And actually, when Epstein was in prison, prison, I guess you could say, because it wasn't like real prison when he was in prison in 2007 and in 2008 and so on. But he visited him, I think, like 20 times, this guy. So there was definitely an association there. And this Prosperi character is the guy that had been very involved in organizing this dinner where Epstein was a first-time donor, and that we know between there 1993 and 1995, somewhere in that period of time, Epstein also made visits to the White House to meet with the special assistant to the then chief of staff of the Clinton administration. So he was going to we don't know what those meetings were about, but we know that, obviously there was some sort of relationship between Epstein and the Clinton administration going on during that period of time. And of course, this is the same period of time where Epstein was involved in negotiating the move of Southern Air Transport to Columbus, Ohio for Wexner, right? So Epstein was very busy, I guess you could say, during this period of time, right? Then we get a little hint into potentially what some of these meetings may have been about from a letter that came from longtime Clinton backer and still Clinton backer, Lynn Forrester to Rothschild, who at this time was just Lynn Forrester, because she didn't marry into the Rothschild family until I think like the year 2000 or so. But at this meeting, she had seen Clinton at a meeting, some sort of informal gathering at Senator Ted Kennedy's house. And she wrote about it as a sort of a follow-up letter to Bill Clinton, saying, oh, she had been so short on time and she had used her, what she called her 15 seconds of access to the president to discuss two things. And that was Jeffrey Epstein and currency stabilization, which I think is quite telling that someone as influential as Lynn Forrester would spend her short amount of time talking about Jeffrey Epstein. We know that in 1993, too, when he was first appearing at these donor functions, that was when Lynn Forrester had her divorce from her first husband, Andrew Stein, and she allegedly enlisted Jeffrey Epstein's help for unknown purposes during that period of time. In relation to her divorce, we don't know exactly what happened there. And we also know that Lynn Forrester is also one of the people that introduced Epstein to some of his more famous or rather infamous contacts, including Alan Dershowitz, who says that he met Epstein through Lynn Forrester to Rothschild. So there's this sort of association going on here. And the fact that he's mentioned in connection with currency stabilization, I think is significant because it came out from other people that reported on Epstein, specifically Vicky Ward, that Epstein used to brag about how he was so great at playing currency markets. He claimed that in his billionaire consulting firm, where Wexner was the only known client, that he put a lot of that money into currency markets, trading currencies, and that a lot of this was known to be done through Deutsche Bank. And actually, Lynn Forrester de Rothschild is a longtime association with Deutsche Bank. She used to be an advisor, I think, to one of their microfinance subsidiaries, and she's even still associated with them today. Some sort of financial charity or something that Deutsche Bank runs. I forget the name, but actually, it was Deutsche Bank that only really formally, officially terminated their accounts with Epstein just a month before his recent arrest. This June was when they ended their relationship with Epstein, and of course he was arrested the first week of July. So there might be something more to that going on. And we know from what I mentioned earlier about how Epstein was involved in sort of this this world of shadow finance, I guess you could say, in the 1980s. And then he's being the president is being, someone is talking to the president about Jeffrey Epstein in relation with currency stabilization. We know he was heavily involved by his own admission with currency markets. So I think that is definitely another avenue for investigation to see exactly what was going on there. But this was all going on before the officially acknowledged Epstein-Clinton relationship that involved Clinton's flights on Epstein's plane, his alleged visits to Little St. James, the infamous island owned by Jeffrey Epstein, and things like that, which happened after Clinton left office. But that association clearly began before then. And I really would like to point out, too, that I think that Epstein, whatever he was doing, I think he was serving multiple roles for intelligence, potentially more than one intelligence agency. I think the sexual blackmail operation and the exploitation of these girls was one aspect of that, but I think that he began as an operative in the worlds of shadow finance, and I think he continued that alongside the sex trafficking, and that this continued after he was first busted for sex trafficking in 2007, because by all appearances it continued just a month before his recent arrest in the first week of July. So I think it's interesting to take these two things side by side, and I think it's there's evidence that Clinton, his relationship with Clinton may have began for one of those reasons, the shadow finance aspect, and then may have moved into the other aspect as well because of what we know about the Bill Clinton-Epstein association on the plane and the island and things like that. It may have moved into that territory, later on after Clinton left office.
Earlier, you mentioned that this side of Iran-Contra and this side of global, illegal trafficking in general, the human trafficking side of things, doesn't get enough coverage. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on why that is. Do you think it's because some journalists are scared to report on something that may sound outrageous at times? Or do you think that it also has to do with, people not wanting to look at and comprehend the fact that children are being used in this way, especially by powerful interests?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a combination of both. I think when you start digging into this type of stuff, especially human trafficking, the extent to which it happens, it obviously has to have state sponsorship to some extent. Otherwise, it would be much easier to stop. A lot of these rackets, I guess you could call them, whether it's arms trafficking or drugs trafficking or sex trafficking, have some sort of official protection, right, when it comes to the involvement of intelligence agencies. And we know that going back to the 1940s, basically once, even the forerunner of the CIA existed, there were alliances made with organized crime. And as I point out in my reporting, that sort of that sort of alliance only really expanded and became more entrenched as time went forward. And so what we've really seen is that a lot of the traditional businesses of organized crime continue to operate, but to some extent, some aspects of them, or factions of them rather, operate sometimes with state protection and even state funding. And I think that's why it's really significant, for example, that Epstein was tied into intelligence. So basically any journalist, at least in the mainstream, right, who are often more careerists than I guess, say, maybe other journalists would be, they start digging into this, they're invariably going to get, involve someone that doesn't want their name out. It could be an intelligence operative or an intelligence front company, or it could be a powerful person like an influential billionaire like Leslie Wexner. For example. And I think we're even seeing that now with the Epstein case, how, in how media coverage is being, how the mainstream media, for example, is covering this. They're just mainly focusing on the death and the investigation. They treat Ghislaine Maxwell as the quote unquote gal pal of Jeffrey Epstein instead of a co-conspirator and serial sex trafficker and accused by multiple victims of being a serial child rapist. And they're basically just turning her into a spectacle. She's here, she's there, that's sick. But beyond that, there's been very little coverage of Leslie Wexner, despite the extent of the Epstein-Wexner relationship. And there's been no pushback from the official excuses that Wexner has given. For example, Wexner claims that before Epstein's first arrest in 2007, that he had discovered that Epstein had stolen money from him, but actually he hasn't provided any evidence for that. And there's actually reports from the time that right before Epstein went to jail during that period of time, he gave $46 million to Wexner. That's the opposite of stealing. So the fact that, the facts are there and they're that blatant, they contradict what Wexner is saying so blatantly, and there's been no pushback, tells you that mainstream media is generally pretty compliant when it comes to reporting certain narratives on things, and they're generally unwilling to push it at the heart of power, and will generally, focus on I guess front people or fall guys and scandals like this. And that's what Epstein has been made to be, even though this is not something that began and ended with him. And now that he's dead, it's easy to pin everything on him because he can't say anything. Right. And the criminal case against him and all the evidence that was gathered against him as part of that will never be made public unless someone else is charged. So the fact they're not charging anyone else is quite telling. And the fact that the mainstream media isn't pushing it back against that, I think is telling as well. But that's just the mainstream media. When we're talking about, other journalists who would be, who are more honest, or more willing to challenge the halls of power, this is this type of I guess subject material, I guess you could say, is not for everyone. It's not something pleasant to write about. I mean, it's important, and it's important to shed light on this horrible stuff going on, but it's not easy to write about, and it's not easy to think about. It's it's not pleasant stuff, and there's plenty of other things going on in the world that I think that some people prefer not to talk about this stuff, or report on things that are maybe easier to digest. But I think it just depends on the journalist doing the reporting, honestly.
You're watching CN Live, and we're speaking with Whitney Webb. We had her on last week, and today we're speaking about the fourth and last installment of our four-part series in Mint Press News, and that is focusing on Bill Clinton and his relationship with Epstein, which goes all the way back to the time that Bill Clinton was governor. If you connect his possible involvement with BCCI and Epstein's involvement with that. Now, we've had an historical first on this interview. Whitney Webb has forgotten a fact. And that fact was the other senator that was involved with John Kerry on the December 1992 BCCI report was Hank Brown, Senator Hank Brown.
Okay, thank you.
I'd be lying to the audience if I say that I ever heard of Senator Hank Brown, so that's why everyone remembers John Kerry, obviously.
Including me.
Now, this might be a second historical fact. There is a fact that I've uncovered in this book called False Prophets by Peter Truell and Larry Gerwin. It was published in 1992, called False Prophets, the word prophet, P-R-O-F-I-T-S, about the BCCI scandal. And they write in here that and this is something they revealed, according to government sources, unnamed, that the FBI began an investigation into Clinton for his possible connection to BCCI. And then we never hear about it again, but on the next page it said the CIA seems to have protected BCCI and its backers for well over a decade, so maybe that's what happened to that FBI investigation. Did you know about this FBI investigation into Clinton's possible connection to BCCI?
Not specifically, but I do know that it was pretty clear that they had some involvement, specifically Hillary Clinton through Rose Law Firm, who was representing, who did basically the legal framework that allowed Jackson Stevens and other people that were on this investor group that were trying to bring BCCI to the United States, because originally this was a bank founded in Pakistan. And they were bringing it to the United States, and that was done mainly by buying up American banks. First American Bank shares being the biggest one that they purchased, and that takeover, the legal work for that was done by Hillary Clinton at the Rose Law Firm, along with Webster Hubbell, who also had a role in the Clinton administration, and Vince Foster, who also had a role in the Clinton administration before his death. So I think there's just enough there to sort of dig into some sort of association that at least they probably knew what was going on. And beyond that, Jackson Stevens being the person bankrolling Clinton's campaigns in Arkansas, and later his presidential campaigns. I think you can, there was likely more information that came out during that time, but I'm not really surprised it would have been suppressed during that time. It's also worth pointing out too that Bill Barr was Attorney General during the time that BCCI collapsed. And he was very involved in covering up things that happened with that, things that happened with Iran-Contra, and also the Promise software. He was the one that appointed Nicholas Bua to do the special counsel to independently investigate the theft of the Promise software that was done by people close to Ronald Reagan, with whom Bill Barr had associations. And of course that didn't go anywhere. So I just think, Bill Barr is back as Attorney General to do what he has shown he has done for his entire career, which is to cover up and to stonewall any congressional investigations that may come up in relation to this. Because actually, I think I mentioned this the last time I was on, that he got his start at the CIA's Office of Legislative Counsel and as the CIA's liaison to Congress during the Church Committee. And he just basically said, that's classified. I can't tell you about that, threat to national security. So I think we can expect a lot more of the same. And the fact that when he was Attorney General the last time, he oversaw a lot of these cover-ups of these seemingly unrelated scandals that really go back to the same core group of people, the same network, whether it's BCCI, Iran-Contra, or the Promise software. He was involved in covering all of that up. And now that Epstein is known, as my series and other people's reporting, I'm sure has shown that he has connections to a lot of the same network, really. I think we can just expect Bill Barr to do the same thing that he's been doing for decades.
You mentioned the word association. I think a critic of your work might say that you're just writing guilt by association. But if you get into the details of what you're reporting, it's hard to, it is circumstantial evidence for the most part here. But these connections are very detailed and extraordinary. Just the idea that, and I did not know this until I read your fourth piece, that Wexner, of course, was the only client that Epstein had in the end, and gave him his house in Manhattan, the largest private residence in Manhattan. That says something. For free. So thanks for reminding me of that. And that it had this spying equipment in there in a basement and a toilet, as you explained to us last time, and that they took over the former CIA airline, which nobody doubts anymore that was a CIA airline. That's completely fact. So there's some real hard evidence here of, for example, that this was CIA airline and Wexner tried to buy it at this time, and that airline was involved in Arkansas in the Iran-Contra, and that Epstein had a connection to Khashoggi, who was one of the big arms dealers in Iran-Contra, and that General Secord as well had some role, I think.
Yes.
Bring that up. Can you just quickly tell us about the General?
Both Alan Fears and Richard Secord were involved in brokering the relocation of Southern Air Transport from Miami to Columbus on behalf of Epstein and Wexner. And of course, those were two individuals very involved in Iran-Contra. I think Fears was actually one of the people charged and later pardoned for his role in Iran-Contra. I think he was in charge of Central America operations for the CIA during Iran-Contra. And then he was one of the people helping Wexner and Epstein to move this airline that had been involved in Iran-Contra to Columbus, Ohio, to do, to run cargo for the Limited, and according to Ohio officials, run other things as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to report on this and try and get to the bottom of this and not accumulate, mostly circumstantial evidence. And that's just, by virtue of the fact that when you're looking into some sort of intelligence operation that has not been declassified, it's really hard to get, the official admissions from the CIA or from any other intelligence agency saying, yeah, we did that, because pretty much, I mean, even when Iran-Contra was first being exposed, I mean, the CIA denied that, and pretty much every scandal in the agency's history, they say that never happened, we never did that. And oftentimes the documentation proving anything, or even the existence of certain operations, it aren't declassified until like 70 years or so after they took place. For example, even the forerunner of the CIA, when they forged that now declassified and admitted alliance with organized crime, they denied that for 40 years after it took place. So, if we're looking at, Jeffrey Epstein's link to intelligence and the possibility that he was an operative or an asset for either U.S. intelligence or Israeli intelligence or both, it's really hard to get this sort of official admission, because these intelligence agencies rarely, if ever, officially admit anything. So what we have to do is look at what we do know, and what I try and do my reporting is just lay out all of these associations that exist and the hard evidence that is there, and just let the reader take away their own conclusions. And I think over the course of this 4-part series, the connections are so so many of these things point back to the same people. And a lot of these same players are so interconnected and also very connected to this type of these type of illicit activities that it's hard to read this and not come to the conclusion, no matter how objective you try to be, that there was not some sort of involvement of intelligence here. And it's also worth pointing out too that someone like Epstein, who was sex trafficking on a large scale and was pretty consistently involved with very powerful individuals, very high profile people, very high profile politicians, and for intelligence in the US to not know he was doing that it would be quite a stretch, I would think, as well, right? And if he wasn't working for this, with intelligence in some capacity, they presumably would have busted him if he represented some sort of, that blackmail could have threatened, that Epstein was acquiring could have threatened the CIA's influence, for example. They would have stopped that very quickly. So the fact that he was doing this sort of stuff for decades, I think, also indicates that there was likely state protection at some point. And we saw this too with Alex Acosta's admission that Epstein had links to intelligence. He said, that is why I gave him the sweetheart deal. I was told to back off. Right. So, the fact that he was doing this because he had state protection, I mean, that pretty much seals it for me. But, skepticism's healthy, but, and I definitely, encourage everyone that reads my report. I link to all my sources in there. Go look at it and see for yourself and come to your own conclusions. I'm not 100% sure after writing all of this work and doing all this research that I know exactly what Epstein was doing at any given point during his entire lifetime. But I think there are some definite conclusions that we can draw, and that from what I put forth in this series, and that is that the CIA has been in a long-standing alliance with organized crime, that they are involved in a lot of illicit activity. A lot of the same players have been involved over the years, and they're continuing to do this today. And that Epstein was very deeply connected to a lot of these individuals, and there are numerous indications that he was involved in a lot of this illicit activity beyond just sex trafficking. And the fact that we have, this cover-up in place by the FBI and the mainstream media is really falling in line behind that, I think also should tell people a lot of what they don't want being reported on in connection with this case.
Well, that's the very nature, of course, of covert operations, so that reporters like you won't be able to find out what was going on. If it was above board behavior, it wouldn't be covert. And the CIA, of course, used this Bank of Credit and Commerce International as a way to run offshore operations that are not funded necessarily by Congress. The CIA has been doing stuff like that for a while. That was an important bank for the CIA, which is why, of course, they cover up their own role in protecting others. You know, I so wish that Bob Perry, our founder and editor of Consortium News in 1995, was with us to talk to you about this, because he was without question, I think, the most important reporter on Iran-Contra. He uncovered the name of Oliver North. We would only know about him because of Bob's reporting. So it would be extraordinary if he were here to hear about this and to talk to you about it. But we're going to do the best we can here. I want to, before I go on to Clinton and the flights, I want a little more detail on that. I want to clear something up, because a lot of our readers and commenters and viewers have been asking or stating that Bill Barr's father, who was the headmaster at the Dalton School, a very swanky Manhattan private school, did not hire Jeffrey Epstein without a college degree to be a math teacher there. But I looked into it, and I read the original New York Times reporting at the time. They did a story when he was fired. He was fired in February, but he didn't leave till the end of June, the end of the semester. I'm talking about Bill Barr's father, who had an OSS background, the precursor of the CIA. And he left the job at the end of the semester in June. And in September of that year, Epstein started working there. Now, as far as I know, most schools are closed or on vacation during the summer, and they don't make hiring decisions in the summer. They would make them in the previous semester, and then the new person would start. So the Times, actually the New York Times now in their reporting did talk about that, and they mentioned, they concluded that it's not certain whether he hired him or not. What is your view of that? It seems to me that he most likely did hire Epstein, didn't he?
Right. So originally, you know, this, a lot of the people that are saying that Bill Barr did not hire his father, they're referring to, or sorry, that Donald Barr did not hire Jeffrey Epstein. They are referring not only to the New York Times article, but mainly actually a Daily Beast article that said that Donald Barr did not hire him because of the timeline. But actually, the Daily Beast, I think a week after they had published that original story, issued a major update, because they they got in touch with the person that followed Donald Barr, who was the interim headmaster beginning in July of that year. And he said that he did not hire Epstein, and that hiring decisions are traditionally made in the spring. And it would fit with Donald Barr's known hiring policy when he was headmaster at the school, which was, you know, considered to be his interest in hiring, quote unquote, unconventional teachers, because he thought it would enrich the experience of students at the Dalton School. And that would be consistent with the fact of Epstein being hired despite having no college degree and apparently being quirky, based on what people that were in his classes and people that worked at the Dalton School during the time had to say about Epstein while he worked there. So it doesn't, I think evidence points to Donald Barr like being the most likely hirer of Epstein. And I think, you know, a lot of people trying to say that Donald Barr wasn't involved are trying to justify the fact that William Barr has not recused himself from this investigation, the fact that he has some sort of family tie in there, or people that are somewhat partisan supporters of the Trump administration and don't want to think that Bill Barr would be involved in this sort of stuff as Attorney General under Trump. I think, you know, a lot of the pushback may be coming from that based on what we know about the facts. But also I think it's significant to point out that not only does Donald Barr, did he have an intelligence background working for the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, but also at the time that he allegedly hired Epstein, his son, William Barr, was working at the CIA during that exact time period. So, you know, there was family connections to the CIA at the time Epstein was hired, and I don't think that point has gotten enough coverage. Also, a quite odd fact here is that the year before Epstein was hired at the Dalton School, while Donald Barr was still headmaster, this is 1973, right? And he leaves in June 1974. In 1973, Donald Barr publishes a book, a sci-fi book about human trafficking and sex slavery, which is quite odd when we consider what Jeffrey Epstein was known to have been involved in. And of course, the headmaster that followed Donald Barr was not considered odd for any of the reasons I've just listed, didn't have intelligence background, says he did not hire Epstein. and things like that. So I think it's, I think, you know, obviously when it's that far back, you know, you probably have to talk to Donald Barr and ask him himself, but he's dead, right? So this is going back into the early 70s, but based on what we know now, the evidence most strongly suggests that it was Donald Barr that hired Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, that's great. I did not know about the new headmaster saying that he didn't hire him, but that would make sense that the hiring decisions would be in spring. I mean, schools closed, but it's really not that important a point. What is important, of course, is Bill Barr's role in all this and being the attorney general then and then now, which is really quite extraordinary because that's a huge period of time that have elapsed between his two tenures. And his role has been to cover things up. And, you know, he still has a relation, I'm sure, with Langley. And he knows what his job is. And that is, he should obviously recuse himself from this. And that's why when I asked you last week whether you thought there would be a really serious investigation, despite what Barr's been saying publicly, he's outraged by the suicide. He's going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to continue to go after all potential co-conspirators, even though he's dead. You don't buy that because he's the head of the bloody Department of Justice, which is right across the street from the FBI right here in Washington.
I mean, to be honest, if they had been serious about investigating this from the beginning when Epstein was still alive, they wouldn't have waited until after he was dead to raid his island. And to date, they have still not raided his New Mexico residence.
Yeah.
Obviously, if they had been interested in actually investigating this thoroughly from the beginning, they would have raided all of his residences simultaneously.
Sure.
When they raided the New York one, they would have raided all of them. So that to me strongly suggests that from the beginning that this was, I guess you could call it a limited hangout of sorts, you know, just a small scale takedown of the operation, pin the blame on the public face of it and ignore the ties to everyone else. Yeah. And sort of pin it on this one guy who is now dead, right? Yeah. So I think, you know, even if we're talking about, you know, the connection, the apparent personal connection of William Barr through Donald Barr to Jeffrey Epstein, I think even if you're just looking at William Barr's past career in ignoring that and his involvement in the history of cover-ups and running interference for U.S. intelligence, and the fact of, you know, just the facts of this current FBI investigation that's going on right now, I think it's really clear what's going on. And I think obviously Bill Barr has to say in public that he's outraged and so on. But I mean, you know, a lot of times politicians or public officials say things they don't really mean, right? I think there's plenty.
No, I don't believe that.
Right. So, I mean, he can't exactly say, I don't care on camera, right? He has to sort of play into this whole narrative that is fun right now.
He does care, but not in the way that we'd like him to care, I think.
Right.
So let me ask you about the flights, because Bill Clinton, I believe, or his spokesman said right after his arrest, the second arrest of Epstein, that he was twice, I think, on the plane, and both times with his Secret Service. But the night before Epstein died, the Southern District of New York released this incredible trench of documents related to the case, which I think even Whitney Webb hasn't probably gone through all of it yet. Maybe you have, I don't know.
No, no, I haven't.
Even Whitney Webb hasn't been able to get through it all. But in there, it showed many, many more than 2 flights by Bill Clinton. Isn't that right?
Well, I haven't looked extensively at those documents, but from what I have seen, it shows much more extensive documentation of the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Richardson relationship, which I think is pretty significant because Bill Richardson, of course, is governor of New Mexico. And we know, right, that Epstein was operating part of his operation out of New Mexico and was also a significant donor to Bill Richardson's campaigns for governors, 2 of them, actually, I believe. But also Bill Richardson was a major, was a cabinet official in the Clinton administration. He was Secretary of Energy. And we also know that there's another Lynn Forrester connection here, that on his, on the advisory board for the Department of Energy, while Bill Richardson was head of that department, Lynn Forrester was on that as well. So a lot of these same players come up in connection to Bill Richardson, but what we know from these documents is that Bill Richardson was accused of raping Epstein's victims, and was very involved in the very sordid activities in which that Epstein was known to have engaged in, and that had not come out publicly. And there was another U.S. politician that was named in there, George Mitchell, and some other, and this was just a partial release, I might point out. So it's interesting that his death followed this so quickly, because basically what it means then is that the criminal case against him, all of the evidence that had been gathered from his New York house that was raided, and presumably from the island when it was raided after his death and all of that. This may be why they waited to raid the island after the death, by the way. Because he died, that criminal case goes away, so everything they gathered during discovery or all other aspects of evidence or testimony or whatever that were obtained prior to his death will now never be made public unless someone else is charged. Right, so that's why we're seeing now mainstream media and in the Department of Justice too, pretty much just trying to pin this on the dead guy and saying, you know, not really pushing for anyone to go after any co-conspirators, because I mean, they'll have to release it publicly. And because of the backlash that even this relatively small partial release, it's a lot. It's not really small because it's a ton of documents, but you know, there's a lot more where that came from, right? And the fact that this, you know, shone light on people and their alleged very bad behavior and created a backlash. And this was just, you know, a small number of powerful individuals named here. Just imagine the other stuff that was uncovered in this, in these other raids and in this other investigation that will never be made public now. So I think the timing there is quite significant.
Why are you sure they will never be made public? I mean, somebody in the Southern District of New York is pretty serious, I think, about this case, because they wouldn't have released all those documents with names like Bill Richardson.
Well, that's a separate lawsuit. So what was released was part of a civil case between one of the Epstein's victims and Ghislaine Maxwell. And it was a partial release from that suit, which I believe is still ongoing. So the criminal case against Epstein, specifically for sex trafficking, that documentation, which includes the raids on his New York house, and whatever was on electronics there, whatever was obtained in that and in other aspects of, you know, that investigation, that will not be made public unless someone else is charged. And because of the sweetheart deal, that apparently made people like Ghislaine Maxwell and people like Leslie Wexner untouchable, because a part of the agreement was that, oh, all this gets pinned on Epstein and he gets a slap on the wrist. So it really seems like, you know, now that he's gone and that criminal case dies with him, right, that any of that potentially damaging to powerful people, that information that was acquired in the time from that first raid and after his arrest, that will not be made public. It remains to be seen what happens with these other civil cases that have been ongoing for years. This one between Virginia Roberts and Ghislaine Maxwell, I believe, was filed in like 2009 or 2008, and the documents are only really coming out now. It remains to be seen if that partial release that was released the day before he died will become a full release. It really depends on the courts there, but you know, I don't really have that much faith in the system to see how much is going to come out now, you know, now that he's dead, and there's this, you know, sort of what I would call a cover-up effort. But, you know, hopefully there will be more that comes out, but I mean, who really knows at this point?
Well, yeah, Epstein got a slap on the wrist and a rope around the neck. And even if the prosecutors are serious, or even the courts about releasing more details, of course, the head of the Department of Justice is William Barr. So he has a thing or two to say about that, and that's very unfortunate. Let me, before I turn it back to Elizabeth, I want to ask you just one question about one piece of evidence that was found in his New York home that became public, and that was this passport, a Saudi Arabian passport, which lists him, or a fake passport with his picture on it, as an Austrian citizen. What do you make of that?
Well, there's been some reporting done that is linked. It's actually an Austrian passport, and it lists, it has Epstein's picture, a fake name, but it lists his residence in Saudi Arabia. And that's quite odd when you think about it, because normally to have an Austrian passport, your residence should be in Austria, not in Saudi Arabia, right? So Vicky Ward, for example, looked at this and said the Saudi Arabia residence appears to be related to his work for Adnan Khashoggi. That was her conclusion looking at this. But the Austria aspect is interesting when we look at, this was allegedly issued in 1987. This passport, when it was found in New York, was long expired and was allegedly issued this year. The official reason the defense attorneys gave for that is that it was given to Epstein by a friend, already used, and was used to protect him in the event that he was on a plane that was hijacked in case he was singled out for being Jewish. That was the official reason. Well, in 1997 in Austria, the US ambassador to Austria was Ronald Lauder. And Ronald Lauder what is the heir to Estee Lauder's and Company's. Lynn Forrester de Rothschild is on the board of that company, by the way. And Estee Lauder and Ronald Lauder have long-standing ties to Roy Cohn, who is a star in my series, I guess you could say, who ran a sexual blackmail operation, had deep ties to the Reagan White House. And also close to Donald Trump. Ronald Lauder said that he's been friends with Donald Trump since Donald Trump was in college at the University of Pennsylvania. And we also know that Ronald Lauder is also deeply tied to Leslie Wexner through the Mega Group that was founded in 1991, but they had been associated before then, having worked together in various philanthropic causes and whatnot, in Jewish and Zionist activism during that period of time. So I lay out in part 3 of my report, for anyone's interested, the other corroborating evidence that suggests that Ronald Lauder may have actually been the source of that passport. But I think the Saudi residency is quite interesting. And it also shows, during this period of time, that he, if you believe that he was using this passport this whole time, he claims that he received it with the stamps on it. But the stamps, show him going from Europe to Africa to the Middle East, really all over the place. And he was really this financial bounty hunter, as he said he was during that time. That would make sense that he was traveling all over the place.
Yeah. Well, you're an American resident in Chile, so that you could be an Austrian living in Saudi Arabia. I wanted to ask you about that Africa trip, because that is you spent a lot of time on that in your piece. Trip that Clinton went with Epstein.
Oh, right. So that was actually a flight that had gotten media attention before Epstein was even arrested, and actually it was arranged. Bill Clinton, I forget who the intermediary was, it might have been Doug Band, but they asked, he had specifically requested use of Epstein's plane for that trip, and tried to arrange, make sure the plane was free well in advance to be used on that trip specifically, which is on this trip to Africa. And it's at the time, it didn't really raise that many eyebrows. It just sort of brought attention to Jeffrey Epstein, like, who is this guy? Because this was before 2007, right? But now we know that a lot of the people on that flight have now been sort of outed for, I guess the best way to phrase it would be sexual deviancy. So for example, Kevin Spacey was there. Kevin Spacey has been accused of raping underage boys, I believe. And it's not just one accuser, it was several. And I believe that case, has not really gotten a lot of media attention ever, and has sort of faded from public view, but I think that's significant. And also, I think the other person present was Ron Burkle, who's this billionaire, and he's known for hiring his excessive interest, apparently, in hiring high-end call girls or high-end prostitutes to service him and his friends. So the fact that all these people were present and that plane specifically was known to be used, a lot of these Epstein's victims say that they were basically put on this plane just for the purpose of being used for sex during these trips, and that Bill Clinton sought out this plane specifically, and all these people came along. I mean, that plane trip specifically has raised a lot of eyebrows, for years, specifically after Epstein's first arrest in 2007. So it's, but of course it's worth pointing out that is just one of Bill Clinton's alleged flights on those planes. Before this latest release of documents came out, it was believed that he was, I believe it was 26 times that he appears in the flight logs. And there's other people that appear on the flight logs as well, closely connected to Clinton, including Doug Band. And I had a source tell me that actually sometimes Clinton, when he didn't want to be, he wanted to do things without his Secret Service detail, he would use Doug Band as sort of his fake name. So people have alleged that, when Doug Band appears on the flight log, that was actually Bill Clinton, but I don't really know how true that is. It could have just been Doug Band because he also appears in Epstein's Black Book of Contacts. But we know that, there was a lot of involvement between people at Clinton and then people in the Clinton administration, including people like Larry Summers, Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton, right, with Epstein, and Bill Richardson, Secretary of Energy, that all these people ended up becoming very closely tied to Epstein and a lot of his shadier activities. Though it is worth mentioning as well that Epstein's most high-profile victim, most well-known victim, Virginia Roberts, claims that she saw Bill Clinton present at several places, including the island, and I believe on planes as well, but she never accused him of raping her or other girls that were present at the time. So it's important to point that out. Because even if someone is clearly associated with Jeffrey Epstein, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were engaged in these activities, but it does mean that they most likely knew what was going on and were okay with it. So it's important to make that distinction.
So women
Definitely.
Women out there who are using Lauda cosmetics and wearing Virginia Secret clothes have no idea what's going on. Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you, and forgive me if Joe asked this question earlier, but to your knowledge, the New Mexico ranch that was owned by Epstein has still not been raided. Is that correct? Has it still not been raided at this point?
Yeah.
What do you make of that? I mean, even though, as you said, as you've made the point, that the criminal investigation of Epstein is over thanks to his death, and we won't see probably the documentation and the contents of the electronics at his Manhattan residence and probably, the island and all of that. Why do you think that the New Mexico ranch still, even with all of that taken into account, has not been raided? Do you think there's any sort of reason for that? Or I'm asking you to speculate, but.
Yeah, I think the reason it hasn't been raided is because they're not interested in actually pursuing this investigation seriously. I mean, why wait to raid the infamous island until after he dies? And they know that most likely the evidence of what they collect there will not be made public. Right.
Well, why raid the island at all? Was it just a publicity stunt after he died to make it look like they were doing something? I mean,
it may have been, but actually there was I think a group of 2 journalists who went to Epstein's ranch. They had planned the trip before he was dead, and they arrived there the morning he died. And they looked in the windows, and there was like the dishwasher. All the lights were on. The dishwasher was open, like someone was about to unload it. There was a child's bicycle. There was a trailer that hadn't been there previously when drone footage was taken during his first arrest. There were a couple vehicles, and then they ended up leaving because dogs were barking, and apparently they got really freaked out, understandably so, and fled the scene, right? But so if these guys were brave enough to go there, and they're not even federal authorities, and they saw that, the lights were on and all this stuff, I mean, it's too late to find anything meaningful there, just like it was too late to find anything meaningful at the island. The guy was arrested. He was at the center of an international sex trafficking ring involving minors, and they waited that long to raid the residences, the 2 main residences besides the New York one that were, according to victims, central to this operation. Right. So I think that's very significant, the fact that it hasn't been raided, and just really underscores how unserious this investigation really is. Honestly, what I think may have really gone on here is that there may have been interest in obtaining that blackmail that Epstein had guarded for the FBI's own purposes as an agency. The FBI has a long history of doing that, going back to the days of J. Edgar Hoover. They may have obtained that in New York. Now they don't have to make it public. Whatever they found at the island, they don't have to make public, depending on how much evidence was there by the time they raided it. But they may know something was going on in that New Mexico residence that they don't even want to get into. Maybe there was crazy stuff going on there that they know activity that may have happened there, and they don't want to open that rabbit hole potentially. I mean, who really knows? There was actually a New York Times article that was quite odd about Epstein wanting to use the New Mexico ranch as part of a covert breeding program to create basically what he considered a master race and impregnate all of these girls that he had essentially enslaved and basically make like a baby farm. And the fact they haven't raided that, I think, is really disturbing. Especially, so maybe there was some other sort of weird stuff going on there. Remember that, intelligence is involved here, has a long history of very odd stuff when it comes to science as well. I don't know. There's so much potentially could have gone on there. We also know, for example, that a lot of these girls were threatened if they didn't have sex with Epstein. I mean, what happens if one of these girls refused and something happened to her, some unfortunate accident or something like that? There could be, cases of that at one of these residences that wasn't rated. We know that prior to his arrest, he was tipped off that charges were coming. He hired like a cement truck, like brought into the island to cover up evidence. I mean, what kind of evidence do you need to cover up that you can't burn, that you need a cement truck for, right? So I think there is definitely like other crazy angles to this, and I think the FBI is very uninterested in exploring them, because any average person, who just looks at this and thinks, how would I investigate Epstein? They would, I think everyone would agree, raid all his residences at the same time.
Exactly.
Before they can destroy evidence.
Of course.
They've waited so long is just nuts. And the fact that they haven't even brought in the co-conspirators, the main ones that we know about, Ghislaine Maxwell and Leslie Wexner, for questioning, I just think it's abundantly clear that they're uninterested. And then you add in the level of who Bill Barr is, the Attorney General, into that, and it's even more clear. People have tried to claim, oh, but there's two investigations. There's the FBI investigation, and there's the Inspector General investigation. But both of the Inspector General, the Justice Department, and the FBI, they both answer Bill Barr.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
both Bill Barr investigations.
I'm glad you mentioned the quote, crazy aspects of this, because I think that is another, as we discussed earlier, the fact that many journalists will not touch the child trafficking, human trafficking side of these trafficking rings that deal in other, illegal activity as well. But another reason for that, in addition to the fact that it's, unpleasant, it's potentially more sensational, is that often they go along with allegations that are more off the wall, whether you're talking about Franklin, whether you're talking about, what maybe potentially could have happened at that ranch, or whether you're talking about another case that the CIA allegedly was involved in kind of hushing up and protecting, which was the Finders cult in the late 1980s, where they basically, turned this cult and the investigation of its trafficking of children into a CIA internal matter. And so the fact, it really does get off the wall when you go into some of those cases. And I think, honestly, even if we're just looking at the child trafficking, when those outlandish elements are part of it, that I think that's when a lot of it, even independent journalists, back off and just kind of go, okay, I'm not going to touch that because my credibility may be damaged by covering it. So. So thank you.
Right. Well, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, right? And a lot of people, I think that's right to bring up, if you explore the real but perhaps crazier aspects of things like this, people, it's much easier to have your credibility attacked.
Right.
Frankly, I mean, if you can document it, it's worth reporting, because frankly, the CIA has been pretty much unaccountable since it was created in the late 40s. What sort of activities do you think a super powerful intelligence agency with links to organized crime and a budget of billions of dollars a year will do with no oversight and complete impunity? I think one can imagine they would get into a whole bunch of super freaky, weird, horrible criminal stuff. So, it may seem odd to us based on, what we've been told to believe is possible and told to believe what the government does, and things like that a lot of this stuff is totally impossible. But really, when you get into the world of like what the CIA has tried to experiment on, at least what we even know about on the stuff that's declassified, like going back to the 1960s, like one
the Church
example,
Committee, et cetera, et cetera. Please continue. Yeah.
So one example that came out from WikiLeaks, right, was that they tried to put all these electronics in a cat and make it like a spy cat, and they basically tortured this poor animal and put hidden cameras in its ears and all this stuff, and then it they try and go send it to test it out, and then it gets hit by a car immediately, and so all that investigation or all that money they spent on that goes away. But they were doing this in the 60s to animals. I mean, that sounds weird, doesn't it? I mean, and they operate with complete, impunity, and they kidnap people. I mean, what sort of crazy stuff do you think they're doing? If they do that to animals, what do they do to people? We know that MK Ultra existed to some extent, and that was an effort to try and, basically erase people's memory and make them, brainwash people essentially with LSD and medication and electroshock therapy and all this stuff. And that's only what we know about it from what was declassified in the 60s, right? And there's never been any accountability for any of this weird stuff and criminal stuff that they've ever done. So the only logical assumption there is that because they got away with it, they're still doing it, right? So
Absolutely.
it's easy, for people in the mainstream to look at people that say this stuff and be like, wow, you're a total kook, but
Yeah.
honestly, these intelligence agencies are so out of hand, and they have been for so long. I mean, honestly, at this point, they could be doing literally anything, and we would not know about it.
And one of the problems with it too is that by pointing out the insanity, you get labeled as outlandish yourself, when all you're doing is pointing out the kind of craziness that does go on. And that is documented, as you mentioned, with the Church Committee, numerous investigations, declassified documentation, and all of that. But I want to turn it over to Joe, but I have one last question. That is, we saw the revelation of these documents less than 24 hours before Epstein died. I know Joe asked about this briefly, but I want to go back to those documents and ask you about George Mitchell. And do you have any other, to your knowledge, is there any other documentation or allegations against George Mitchell about, sexual abuse of minors or young women or anything to that nature that you're aware of, other than these documents released recently?
I didn't look at that specifically. I think his name had come up, but it wasn't as extensive as what he had been accused of in these new documents. But I haven't looked into that specifically. So I don't really, I guess you'd have to, look at the documents because I haven't really dug into that. I've been, I was concluding the series, and that was its own can of worms. So hopefully I'll be able to get to that at some point. But other people have written more extensively about that. The newer revelations than I have. I'm looking more at like the history aspect in this. So sorry, I can't give you a
No, that's fine. No, you've done an incredibly extensive investigation of this, and yeah, absolutely huge. So thank you for being willing to speak with us so long. Joe?
Yes, thank you. George Mitchell was this bipartisan hero who was, of course, involved in the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland and Middle East peace broker. That didn't work out very well. But to see his name there was a bit of a shock to me. I guess I bought the PR, but then I interviewed him once actually over the phone. And he was this very gentle, kind of considerate and thoughtful person who also may be swept up in all of this. It's just extraordinary. I have a very odd question, but that story about the DNA operation shows just the mindset. That and the Harvard t-shirt. Those two things really, despite all of these crimes you were talking about that he committed, that Harvard t-shirt and the DNA shows what a megalomaniac this guy was, how he needed the validation of what he thought was the aristocracy or the ruling class of the United States, particularly, an old Anglo-Saxon institution like Harvard University. So he gave money to them. He never even had a university degree of any kind, and yet he loved wearing the Harvard t-shirts. He gave money to them. He went to seminars, and scientists, were letting him go forth with his theories, and they didn't care whether they made sense or not because he was funding them. I find that so corrupting, so outrageous. Even if none of these scientists ever went to his island, that's also, they got sucked into this orbit of a system in which there's this reverence for some idea of the ruling class, and Harvard being like the premier institution for that he had to associate himself with that. And then the DNA thing, I got to ask this question because the Times didn't really broach it. Normally, you use artificial insemination when you're going to do something like that. But knowing Epstein as we do, did he intend to impregnate these women himself?
Well, I don't really know the specifics of the plan. This is from this New York Times article, is really the only reporting about it, but that this is based on the scientists that he was funding and talked to, that he had said this is what he wanted to do. And he had also talked about cryogenically freezing just his head and his genitals and nothing else, and to preserve that after his death, and like a bunch of other really odd stuff. But some of the people named in the New York Times article, that scientists that he was funding, were people that were very involved in genetics, specifically things like CRISPR gene editing and gene splicing. And people, one of the guys, I looked him up, he had made comments a few years prior about how he thought that if he found an adventurous human female surrogate, that he would try, it would be possible to try and bring back the Neanderthals. And this is like the mindset of the scientists that Epstein is funding. And he's talking about like doing these weird genetic experiments on women. I think it's quite sick when you think about it. But it's worth pointing out too that, this is really, it boils down to an interest in eugenics. And so like, Epstein was part of this, elite bubble where the ruling class operates. And if you look back into the history of the American ruling class, really going back to people like J.D. Rockefeller, the country's first billionaire, there was an extensive interest and eugenics campaign going on in the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It even resulted in Supreme Court rulings where it was ruled constitutional for states to sterilize women based on their perceived intelligence by the state. That is extremely disturbing. A lot of this obviously fell out of fashion in World War II because of the Nazis and Hitler and the genetic aspect and the mass race and all of that there. But there's a lot of indications that this sort of mentality continues to exist in the American ruling class. It's just sort of changed form, or rather gone underground, and we're seeing this sort of come out with Epstein. But I really don't think it's far-fetched to think that there are other members of the American ruling class that think they are genetically superior to people beneath them, right? I mean, we see that in the way they treat the regular, people of the United States. And how they corrupt how some of these people corrupt our institutions and our government. So I really don't think that would be far-fetched. I think Epstein is really offering us a glimpse into this world of the ruling elite that is, it's really like its own bubble. I mean, these people don't interact with regular everyday people. They're all isolated in their weird social circles. With their own interests in this type of stuff and other things, they don't have to interact with regular people, and that's how stuff like this continues. And so I think the longstanding history of interests of the American elite and that type of stuff, and that Epstein was heavily funding a scientist with that sort of interest and purpose in mind, I think is really is troubling, especially when you consider his ties to intelligence, for example. And that he had connections to these sorts of institutions and other powerful individuals. Maybe some of those institutions or people at those institutions and some of these powerful individuals, like Leslie Wexner example, who bankrolled a lot of his operation, may also have had some sort of interest in this master race type of ideology. Very disturbing to think about.
It reminds me of that quote that Ghislaine Maxwell apparently told a friend when the friend asked, well, what about all these poor girls? And she said, oh, they're just trash. Mm-hmm. You saw that. I mean, that's the mentality here. That's the pathology that we're talking about, of people who amass too much power, too much wealth, and have too much time on their hands, and think that they are indeed superior genetically. And you mentioned Adolf Hitler. It's documented that he got a lot of his ideas, if not all of them, from the American eugenics movement. So it started.
That's very overlooked, isn't it? But that's absolutely true. He cited a lot of American policies from the early 20th century as inspiring what he ended up enacting. And as I mentioned, obviously that fell out of favor publicly at that time, but there's a lot of indications that this is just among the American ruling elite. They just weren't as overt about it, and it went more underground.
Now, my final question, speaking of pathology and insanity, I want to ask you about Donald Trump. What do we know about his involvement at all with Epstein right now? And you expect to hear more, because I had some hopes, maybe naively, at the beginning of this, that because they didn't get Trump on Russiagate, that they were going to try to nail him with his connection to Epstein being a child rapist, and everybody in the country would support impeachment of a president who could be proven to be involved. That's not a political issue anymore. So what do we know about Trump's involvement? And do you expect anything to come out of that? Because again, I was hoping the Democrats would push somehow to get more about at least Trump's involvement. And that the Democrats would push
Sorry, what was the last part?
that the Republicans would push to get information on Clinton and the Democrats to get information on Trump's relation. And that's why I thought we might actually learn something in this scandal.
Well, so I think this whole thing about partisan people on the left being look at Epstein Clinton or Epstein Trump, and people on the right being like look at Epstein Clinton, I think all that it has really accomplished is to just keep exacerbating the divisiveness of American politics today. I think people like the FBI, for example, whoever's investigating this, I think they know full well that if you try and take down one powerful person in connection to Epstein, it's going to pull on another thread that pulls into another thread. These people are so interconnected that it'll just take everything down.
What we want. That's what we want. But anyway.
Right. But I think in order to protect the racket, right, to protect the system, they'll avoid doing that. As far as Trump's ties to Epstein go, Epstein was very clearly involved in a lot of this New York shadowy sort of underworld, above world society that Roy Cohn, his mentor, Donald Trump's mentor, was very much at the center of. And Roy Cohn, of course, was involved in a sexual blackmail operation and the trafficking of underage boys beginning in the 1950s up into the 1980s. He met Donald Trump in 1973. And that relationship was incredibly close. According to Roy Cohn, Donald Trump called him as many times a day as he said like 17 times a day, Donald Trump calls me. The last person that talked to Roy Cohn before he died, according to Roy Cohn's longtime secretary, was Donald Trump. They were incredibly close. People that were around Roy Cohn would often cite that he was frequently accompanied by an entourage of young blonde boys. And I point out in my reporting that there is a lot of corroborating evidence from several sources that he was involved in the sexual trafficking of minors. So Donald Trump, to be that close to someone involved in that activity, was clearly comfortable with people doing this. I don't think that that Trump specifically for that reason was targeted by Epstein for the purpose of procuring blackmail. I think that he was associated with Epstein because they were part of the same swamp, is how I would put it. That he knew that these type of operations went on through his relationship with Roy Cohn, and that he saw that same type of deal going on with Epstein. Though it is worth pointing out too that Donald Trump does have some sort of shady activities going back into the early 90s and the late 80s, like when he bought the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan and things like that, that out at the Plaza Hotel, which is actually where Roy Cohn ran his sexual trafficking operation. It was purchased not long after Roy Cohn died. Donald Trump would have these parties that were organized, and they would have a lot of, according to people that organized these parties, would actually have underage girls present, but it would be a don't ask, don't tell type of thing. And they were promised that if they, associated or slept with some of these older wealthy men, that it would advance their careers. And we see some sort of overlaps with some activities that Donald Trump was engaged on well before his political career, such as his this modeling agency he tried to set up. That there were similarities. People have alleged that there's similarities between that modeling agency, the type of modeling agency that Jeffrey Epstein himself tried to set up around that same time period, and that John-Luc Brunel, another co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein, was also running modeling agencies that were also had a lot of shady stuff going on behind the scenes, and Donald Trump seems to have had some sort of operation. But I honestly think that Donald Trump didn't do the same thing Jeffrey Epstein did at anything. I think he sort of, if he did it, he tried to like have it on some murky gray line of legality, sort of like the Diet Coke version of what Jeffrey Epstein was doing. We know that they were associated at parties. That footage came out, I think it was from NBC, of them at a Mar-a-Lago party together in the early 90s. There's photos from the early 90s of Donald Trump with Ghislaine Maxwell. Donald Trump was present at yacht parties on Robert Maxwell's yacht, who's the known Mossad operative, who was the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. So there's plenty of evidence that these people really swim in the same swamp, but I don't really think whatever Epstein had is as damaging to Trump as say, Bill Clinton. Just because, of the flight logs. Donald Trump was only shown to have flown once on the plane. And by all indications, at least after, the year 2000, the relationship was stronger with Clinton's than it was with Trump. But I think, if there was any meaningful investigation to either the Epstein-Trump ties or the Epstein-Clinton ties, they would eventually, that investigation would eventually show that these people, you know, this is a bipartisan thing. People connected to people on both camps, Trump and Clinton, you know, were involved in this and knew about it. To a significant degree. There's plenty of indication that Trump knew that Epstein had these young girls around him all the time and it didn't bother him. There's a quote from him in 2003 that he said, "Jeffrey Epstein's a terrific guy and he likes women on the younger side," things like that. You know, so, and given his past association with Roy Cohn and that Roy Cohn was often said to be surrounded by young blonde boys, this type of behavior didn't bother him, but potentially he may have partaken in it. There's actually an interview, I think that a radio interview with Howard Stern, I think, where he's with Ivanka, and Howard Stern says, you know, jokingly says to Donald Trump, you know, people accuse you of being a sexual predator, what do you think? And Ivanka is the one that says, but he is one, and then starts laughing, and then Donald Trump's like, yeah, I guess. No, so I mean, none of these people are clean. It's just, you know, this is really, you know, when you get to the levers of the halls of power where decisions are really made, this isn't about Team Red or Team Blue, Team Trump, Team Clinton. This is about amassing as much wealth, power, and control as possible. That's what, you know, drives these. How these decisions are really made, right? And we see this time and again, not just today, but if you look back into the history, it's there too. Trump has been associated with this swamp, whatever you want to call it, at least since the 70s, probably before then. And, you know, Epstein was involved with, you know, both Clinton and Trump, was seen around them at around the same time, is said to have met Trump in 1987. He's known to be going to Clinton functions in 1993. I mean, these ties go back a long time. And Clinton, of course, was involved in this same swamp too, going back to, you know, Iran-Contra in the early 80s. Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's mentor, very involved in the Reagan White House, actually introduced Rupert Murdoch to Ronald Reagan, and was like super connected to this. So there's a lot of overlap here. And it's really not, it's not a partisan thing as much as, you know, some media outlets have tried to make it. And honestly, to me, that says that they're just trying to use this to get people, you know, keep people in the partisan divide, and from realizing the clear bipartisan nature of this, because anyone looking at the Epstein case effectively is going to notice right away that there's a lot of Republicans and there's a lot of Democrats, and that it's not, you know, it becomes quite clear relatively quickly that this isn't about party allegiance, or Epstein was not just associated with Democrats and not associated with Republicans. He was associated with a bipartisan power elite.
How ironic that Trump was elected saying he wanted to clean up the swamp.
Yeah.
What did Cohen, I'm sorry if I should know this, did Cohen have meet Epstein? Did they have a relationship?
No, I don't believe so. But we do know that Roy Cohn's, his sexual blackmail operation was connected to other sexual blackmail operations. He was very good friends and associated with Craig Spence, who was running the callboy ring that, you know, was a sexual blackmail operation, had underage boys as well. They had connections with the George H.W. Bush White House, and allegedly took some of those underage boys on midnight tours of the White House in the early 90s. And that was connected to Roy Cohn, and Craig Spence was known to be operating with Larry King, for example. So there's a lot of indications that a lot of these rings that were tied to this Iran-Contra apparatus were connected, and that we know that Epstein was tied to this same apparatus in Iran-Contra during that period, and then began running a sexual blackmail operation with associations with intelligence. So I think it's very possible that it was part of the same expansive racket, because once you start doing these type of sexual blackmail operations, these go back to at least the 50s, with, you know, Roy Cohn's anyway, goes back to at least then. It expanded since then. There were several of these that were going on at any given time. A lot of the ones that came out in the press involved underage boys. Epstein's involved underage girls, so we can assume that why this was going on with Roy Cohn and Craig Spence and Larry King and all of these people with underage boys, there was likely a parallel one with underage girls going on in that same period that never came to light. Similarly, while Epstein was doing this type of activity with underage girls, it would make sense that there was also someone just like Epstein, who's probably still around, that was that runs or ran underage boys during the same time period, right? Because that would make sense based on what we know about the history of these types of operations. So regardless of whether Roy Cohn, from what I understand, Roy Cohn and Jeffrey Epstein never met, but what they were doing is part of the same enterprise, I guess you could call it, that involves, you know, U.S. intelligence and organized crime and sexual blackmail operations. Of course, Epstein's had ties into Israeli intelligence. We also know, speaking of Roy Cohn, for example, that he had a lot of very deep ties to pro-Israel lobby groups, including the Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith, and was very involved in pro-Israel politics in the U.S. and also in Israel.
Well, they both lived in New York. It'd be surprising if they didn't meet, but of course, going back to 19...
Well, it's possible. It's possible they met, but I haven't seen any direct evidence of that, so I'm not going to make that.
You say that wasn't bothered that Cohn's involvement in all these things. He and all these others weren't bothered by Cohn's going back to 1950s, being the chief counsel to Joseph McCarthy, and the McCarthy hearings being one of the most scandalous, if not most scandalous, political episode in American history. And it comes down again to this pathology of people of complete impunity who treat the people as their fodder to go to war, to have pleasure with, to do their jobs for them, to fire them when they don't need them anymore. Just total contempt for the public because they think that they are different somehow, that they are indeed another species, and that we're just, we're subspecies, and they are in control. And Whitney Webb has done an enormously great job in her 4-part series at Mint Press News. I ask all of you to go and read them all if you can. It's going to take some time. I think you ought to put it together into a book, Whitney.
I may.
Yeah, you're welcome. Really.
Time permitting. I'd like to do that.
And before we leave you, can you give us some inkling of your next piece about the circumstances around his death, or do you want to keep that for
Well, one of the spin-offs that I plan to be doing and investigating has to do with the financial aspect of what he was doing for intelligence agencies. I mentioned that earlier, how I think he was doing both the sexual blackmail operation as well as these financial services, whatever you want to call it, in the world of shadow finance that he had been doing from the 80s well up to the present. I think that activity specifically, which he clearly continued after his arrest in 2007, and after that prison sentence, may have been the reason that he was arrested this time, because there was a change in policy for federal agencies and how they report their finances that would have made the role that I believe Epstein played in laundering money irrelevant, because basically now any federal government agency can have a public financial statement that is a lie and a private one that is accurate, and they do not have to tell the public if the public statement is modified, if it's true or not, which is totally insane. And that happened last October, just a few weeks before the Miami Herald expose came out, that is said to have been one of the reasons, one of the factors behind the federal charges being prepared against Epstein. I think there may be a connection between that and the fact that the main bank Epstein was using did not begin to terminate its relationship with him until both of those things had happened, and that continued right up until his arrest in July. So I think there may be something to that, and I've done some interviews that suggest that that is the case, and as well as the source of the money that Epstein was laundering, and that another one of these associations or one of these organizations or that were involved in laundering the same money was also the Clinton Foundation. So that'll be in the spinoff coming up, hopefully in another month or so. We'll see how quickly I can put it together. It's a lot of stuff to sort through.
We're all looking forward to that, and the Miami Herald should get some credit because it's normally the mainstream media and the intelligence agencies that cover up all this activity, but in that case, at least they probed a little bit deeply. Thank you, Whitney, again for joining us for a long interview. We're looking forward to your next piece, and hopefully we'll have you back again sometime on CN Live.
Okay, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.